budget document that's in your packets. We'll hit on some of the highlights, and then, of course, open it up for questions that you may have. Remember, this is a draft, right? So you've got a cover page, and then you've got an assumption sheet in that budget. And that assumption sheet, page 1, identifies these highlights. This is a draft budget, right? This is an early look, a very preliminary look, and it's focused primarily, and our conversation will be focused primarily on the general fund, and specifically general fund revenue. In those assumptions, we identify the per pupil rate that is driving the revenue in this budget. We identify the funded pupil count, and I'll talk about these as we get going. We also identify estimates for charter school funding that flows through the district and to our district charters. And then ultimately, we'll get to talk about what is the amount, the difference, the delta that we see between the revenue identified and expenditures as we know them now, basically the current fiscal year expenditures. That's the amount really available that we're working with to close the gap here in the next month or so when developing a proposed budget. All right, so additionally in that budget document, just as you're navigating through there, you're looking, you see a variety of columns. You're going to see a previous year actual column. Hey, that's fiscal year 24, that's last year. Hey, I keep getting mixed up. What is this year? I talk about this year as already 2026 in my brain, but last year is fiscal year 24, 23, 24. The current year, 24, 25, that budget, the revised budget that was passed in January, is identified in the document, as well as estimated actual figures that were generated at the end of the third quarter of the fiscal year, the end of March. Additionally, now we've got a column for next year, the preliminary budget for fiscal year 26. That's the 2025-26 budget, and that fiscal year starts on July 1st. The funds, what funds are in there? Well, remember a couple weeks ago we started to talk about more of the other funds. We felt the other funds were being left out from time to time. Okay, they're in there. We probably won't hit on them a lot unless there are questions. There are some adjustments there, but primarily we're looking at the general fund, which is on pages 2 through 5, and summarized again on page 14 of your document. Those other funds are identified throughout pages 6 through 13, and they should also reflect the same fiscal years, the actual from 24, the current budget and estimated actual, as well as a preliminary look at next year's fiscal year 26 budget. All right, so let's talk about the revenue picture. The revenue picture, and this is page 2, I believe, of your document. This is a screenshot that you have on the screen that shows the overall summary of the district general fund revenue. And it's important to remember that we're going to look now at 100% of the general fund revenue. And I'll talk about different breakouts of what makes up that revenue. Okay, but we're going to focus on that far right column primarily. That's the 2025-26 preliminary budget. And the assumption that we're building this budget on is the same as a couple weeks ago at 28,613.9 funded pupils. And we talked about what funded pupils mean a couple weeks ago. This is an averaged count. It's based on 4 years of averaging, and it does include district charter schools. Okay, right below that, this would be line 2 before state reductions. This is the per pupil rate, $11,160.06. This is slightly different than we presented a couple weeks ago, and there's an important reason for that. In the period that has passed, we learned about changes to ascent funding, and the changes to ascent funding will modify our per pupil rate a little bit. Okay, so ascent students, Ascent is a concurrent enrollment program, basically fifth year high school type program. It has been funded at a similar rate in previous years to the rest of our program. The projection is for next year, and it's still pretty early for getting this really hopefully closely dialed in, is that might drop by about $3,000 per pupil next year. Okay, so that's going to impact our per pupil rate. Now I'm going to talk about that more, and I'm going to show you what we estimate that to be. So $11,160 and change per pupil. Okay. Lines 5, 6, and 7 detail the combination of our total program. We've talked about total program a lot, and I'm going to show you it in probably a few different ways here tonight. Line 5 is state equalization. Okay, that's the backfill, right? And we've heard that term used at various times throughout the budgeting process. Okay, the formula is designed in 1994, is supposed to generate funding for schools out of property taxes. Okay, property taxes in most districts cannot accommodate the totality of the formula. So the state must equalize or backfill dollars to make the formula whole. That $163 million, that's the state equalization number that we're anticipating to make the formula whole next year. Hey, we anticipate that the formula will drive $147.2 million of property tax into the system and another 8.8 of specific ownership tax. Remember, specific ownership tax, those are the taxes on licensing vehicles and boats and those kinds of things. Right, so line 8 details our total state formula, also known as the total program. Total program, $319.3 million. That's about 73% of this general fund revenue. Okay, we focus heavily on that when we talk about the budget because it's 3/4 of the budget. It's the big deal. And we'll talk about where are we with our certainty of that number here shortly. Hey, below that, we get into some other revenue items. Local revenue, $84.5 million. That is primarily mill levy overrides from various years, including not including the 2024 mill levy override because that's in a separate fund, but most recently the 2019 mill levy override that grows by the rate of inflation. Other state revenue is in line 12. Primarily, that's driven by categorical funding. And we talked about that last time a little bit as well. Extra funding for specifically focused on like transportation or special education, vocational education, those items. And then line 13, the anticipated federal revenue in our general fund, about $3 million. Primarily, that's Medicaid reimbursements. Okay, so it's not really new money, it's really reimbursing programming that we've already taken on. So at the very bottom right of that visual, $434,351,987, the anticipated preliminary general fund revenue. That's $9 million or so greater than the current year, fiscal year 25. Okay, so I pointed these numbers out. Line 14 has those operational revenues. Line 16 also indicates our beginning balance of reserves. That has an asterisk by it. Without all of the expenditures plugged in, really the reserve summary is incomplete until we get calculations including all of the reserves or all of the expenditures plugged in there. But if you'd like to look into more detail of the revenues or reserves, those are on pages 4 and page 5. So more assumptions. Okay, what's behind, especially that total program number, that $319 million? We've talked about this before. The 2.3% inflation rate is driving the School Finance Act. Additionally, for the second consecutive fiscal year, there is not scheduled to be a budget stabilization factor in the formula. And the phase-in of the new School Finance Act itself with some changes in how some of the factors are calculated and implemented is producing that change in revenue. Primarily, remember that now we're looking at a 4-year funded pupil count averaging mechanism as opposed to the previous 5-year mechanism and also as opposed to what was initially proposed as a 0-year average. So as we're looking at that, remember also that we're anticipating and expecting that this is a tiered averaging mechanism in the new formula that's supposed to move to a 3-year averaging the next year, then 2, and then work its way out of the school finance formula. Okay. Right now, if we were to compare that per pupil rate range Hey, we're up about $381.80 over fiscal year 25's value. And that funded pupil count, again, this includes district charters, down 235.2 funded pupils. Now, I talked a little bit about Ascent, and it's important to note that change, we think, is going to impact both sides of our revenue and expenditures by about $700,000. Okay, fewer Ascent revenues coming in because of a lower per pupil Ascent rate, but then conversely, then we'll have fewer Ascent expenditures going out. Okay, so that has impacted that change in the per pupil rate compared to what you saw a couple weeks ago. We are still awaiting some information. I understand that the long bill, which is the appropriation of the budget for the state, was passed late last night. The School Finance Act, if you were to look at it, a little bit ago I looked, still says under consideration. So that means the dollars they're there, now they're figuring out exactly are we satisfied with where we want them to be and go. So as that sorts itself out, we continue to await then the fiscal runs that come from CDE. They give us a pretty clear idea of whether our planning is on track or we need to modify that a little bit. Late last week, I understood from some CDE finance folks that there might still be some modifications in that Charter School Institute multi-district online impact. And we talked about that a couple weeks ago, kind of an unknown. It's still, for us right now, it's an unknown until we can see this formula with those hopefully removed from some of the size factor calculation, but still to be known from our perspective. So a different way to look at it, this is similar to a graphic I showed you a couple weeks ago, excuse me. We've got columns there that compare fiscal year 24, 25, and on the farther right, slightly highlighted, 26. We anticipate that funded pupil count is down by about 0.8%, and that per pupil funding rate of $11,160, up about 3.5% due to the new formula and the 2.3% inflation rate embedded in there. Overall, an increase in total program by about 2.7%. Now, you'll see a slightly different number here in the total program, 319.3, and it's slightly different than what's in the calculations in the actual budget. That's because the embedded table in this slide doesn't quite do the same level of rounding, right? So it's just slightly different. This is part of the presentation. The document portion would be the actual number. It's slight variation. Still rounds ultimately to the same number. The fiscal year 25 to 26 change, this includes our district charters. This is less than we showed you last presentation because of that change in the Ascent funding. Okay, so I went ahead and factored that in to the per pupil funding rate. Okay, so what we see here is overall just that change, about $8.4 million of increased funding. However, the charter flow-throughs also a different number than we looked at a couple weeks ago. As we have received the proposed budgets for each of our in-district charter schools, it's apparent that their enrollment projections are higher than what we initially anticipated, up about 136 in district charters. That would equate to about 2.6, almost $2.7 million of flow-through. When you remove those, we've got an increase in program funding to the district of about $5.7 million that we're anticipating in this preliminary budget. Going to keep slicing this different ways, show you kind of different ways to look at it. This is actually a view of a worksheet that we try and go through as just kind of a real high-level planning look at our preliminary budget. And this was shared with our budget design team and our budget advisory committee. That top line in this table, total program, $8.4 million, really this just summarized what I showed you in the previous slide. What we didn't incorporate quite yet into the previous, or in that previous slide, were these two highlighted lines. The 2019 mill levy override, which you'll find on page 5, line 16, we anticipate that to increase by $500,000. That's the one of our mill levy overrides that grows by the rate of inflation. So 2.3%, we will certify a number that's 2.3% higher in December than we did this year to generate that additional $500,000. Okay. The state categorical numbers, again, at the time we put this together, that was estimated to grow by about that rate of inflation. Those combined about a $400,000 increase. Now that the long bill has passed, we can start to dig into that, and they're hidden in there a little bit. You got to go find them, and we'll find those actual appropriations and update this for the proposed budget for those changes. But we anticipate that they consistently stay about that rate of inflation with increases. Okay, when you add those together, you've got a $9.3 million shared revenue increase, and then again, you take those charters out, 2.7. Now we're talking about overall a revenue change of about $6.6 million in the program funding, and then adding in mill levies and state categoricals. Now we're talking overall revenue. Okay, so on the other side, and a couple weeks ago we prepped you of really we're not going to adjust much on the other side yet, and really haven't. But there are a few either high-level assumptions or knowns that are included on the other side so that we can get them in there now and start planning accordingly. We do know that staff benefits on the health side of things are slated to go up again next year. Pretty consistent theme, 5%, about $1.6 million to the district side of things. Utilities and insurance cost increases. We're pretty confident in the utilities amount of about $500,000. On the risk side of things, those insurance premiums, we really don't get a lot of that data till early May. So we've got an estimate in there, and we'll modify that as we get some of that information. Then on what early childhood non-federal share is, this $1.3 million, is a budget we must set aside really to illustrate our part of our funding of our early childhood programs, okay, when we have Head Start in the mix. And last time, Kara talked through a lot about grants and those interactivities with the general fund, and this is one of those things where we do have to set aside dollars in our general fund to make sure we're satisfying the programming of our early childhood programs. Okay, so typically we've in previous years used some restricted dollars, okay, to make sure that happens. What we want to make sure we do and highlight now, especially with changes and potential changes that may or may not come, is we want to really make sure we call this out in the budget. We've got that set aside so we can take care of our early childhood program. Hey, on the expenditure side of things, other items, hey, we've got some departmental budget cuts, reductions at central levels to the tune of about $1.7 million. That Ascent expenditure I talked about, remember we're going to reduce revenue by about $700,000, also then would reduce expenditures at the same rate. And then school budgets, we've compared really fiscal year 26 budgets that are rolled out and fiscal year 25. So taking fiscal year 25's enrollment at the fiscal year 26 rates, and when you compare those and analyze our funding of the size factor and those kinds of things, really about a $5.3 million reduction. However, as I think was mentioned earlier, is an infusion of $4 million from the debt-free mill levy in there for small school support in various forms. And we detailed that last time with foundational funding, zero-based funding, and size support funding, and then supporting SBB, student-based budgets at the schools. Okay, when we factor all that in, those are really the changes you're going to see on the expenditure side. Okay, we factor all of that in, you get to page 3, line 53, okay, and real simple slide, and somebody in budget design team told me this a couple weeks ago, right? Just tell me the number. What's the number, right? Okay, so right now that's the number we're looking at. When you look at the operational or the total overall revenue in the general fund versus those knowns and our current expenditure level, about $10.3 million available, okay, to work with. And when I say to work with, I'm talking about, okay, we've got a negotiations process ongoing to analyze compensation, okay, other budget priorities, other critical needs that may or may not emerge here as we wrap up the legislative session and the end of the fiscal year. So really, that's the number we're working with as we know it right now. Okay, so what's next? As I mentioned, the long bill is passed. The School Finance Act now should be pretty much done, but we need to see the numbers. We need to see the formula. Negotiations are moving along, and we'll start to really tackle the compensation side of things here as they finalize things throughout the year. Again, if there are additional critical needs or budget priorities that need to be inserted in the budget or discussed or evaluated through budget design team or budget advisory committee, then those would have to be factored in as well, with an anticipated proposed budget date presentation of May 27th, 2025. And then budget adoption no later than June 30th, but right now scheduled for June 10th of this year. Okay, so again, a build off of 2 weeks ago, but what questions, comments do you have that we can talk about and then answer?
Brian, could I ask for just clarification on the mention of charter school growth? As I understand it, the primary driver there is that one of our district-sponsored charter schools is opening a middle school next year, not growth necessarily across all of those charters. Is that correct?
Correct. Really see the growth and the projected enrollment growth is in one specific. Yeah, the bulk of it for sure. In fact, one other one is projecting slight declines and kind of nets out another one.
Thank you for that clarification. Are there questions? Go ahead, Carolyn.
So I'm reading this week that there's a push to eliminate early Head Start programming at the federal level. And I saw you say that we're going to have to set aside $1.3 million for Head Start as our contribution to our part of it. If they were to end funding for early Head Start, what was the Fed's part of that? What part would we be missing if that happened?
Yeah, great question. I'm racking my brain. 2 point, do you know?
The total Head Start expenditures are $5.8 million. So that's early Head Start and Head Start. That's the federal portion in addition to our one-ish million dollars.
Thank you, Karen.
Okay, so, and I guess I would just like us all to kind of think about that and keep our heads wrapped around that, because if that funding does go away, I would think as a district and a community, we'd have to decide what are our priorities and values around keeping Head Start if we lose federal funding. I think it's something that we have to think about.
And to that end, Carolyn, I think there's also, we need to be thinking about Title I. There's been talk about a 20% reduction in Title I overall. And then Title III, was it Title III and IV, possibly being eliminated. So I think those are all things that we need to be aware of. And so when we talk about having the $10 million, we need to be aware that this is right now, and what may be coming in the future may be very, very different. So thinking about those rainy days, they may be coming.
Yeah, I would say, having been through this almost 19 years now of different budgets, this is definitely a budget cycle as we go into the future that we want to be a little more thoughtful about how we're stepping into things. Like you mentioned, any of the federal programs, if they were to change, we're going to have some hard conversations as a district around prioritization and what are those things that are important, and how might we be able to do that. But we probably would be very wise to maintain a good reserve balance going forward.
Go ahead, Kevin.
Did you have a question? I think this dovetails into the next steps question that I had. It was a larger one. So next steps is finalizing critical needs and budget priorities. You've already identified one, I think a few that I've heard. So looking at our timeline, proposed budget, May 27th, 2025, budget adoption, June 10th, 2025. This may be an unfair question, but at what level of certainty are we going to have come June 10th? And building up to that, the board meetings in between, what opportunities are we going to need to have some of those frank discussions? And I'll add another one in there too. We've heard a little bit tonight is, I think, going a little more granular, the devil is going to be in the details as far as identifying this small school support measure too. I'm still wrapping my head around some of that. I have some thoughts that are somewhat unfinished at this time, but more importantly, I want to make sure that we've got the opportunity to discuss some of these things before we're adopting a budget. So can anyone articulate what those next steps would look like? Are we going to have agenda items for this so we can have robust conversations? Because I think we're going to be grappling with some very difficult questions and not knowing with
Yeah.
certainty what the
Yeah.
answers may be.
So as I forecast and think ahead, negotiations is a big part of it. And so getting some understanding of where negotiations is gonna fall and finalize is gonna be a big piece of that puzzle. Yeah, I think that, the other pieces as we talk about the federal funds and all of those other pieces, as far as the track that we're gonna have to go, I'm not anticipating that we're gonna have any new news by that time for those. The other pieces as far as the small school, piece from debt-free mill levy, just in having conversations tonight, I've got some ideas I'd like to go and work on a little bit to see if there's a different way to think about that. And so those would be the timelines, I guess. The negotiations is the really big one. But we will also be, because when we do negotiations, we also have to, this is where budget development and negotiations kind of have to dovetail in the end, is that for negotiations to finalize, we need to understand what the critical needs are as well. And so it's kind of a hand in hand, that those are really the last pieces, as you named them. It's the critical needs, and that's the compensation.
And one last-
One other item to answer that question. Statutorily, we've got to deliver a proposed budget to you by May 31st. Statutorily, we've got to adopt a budget by June 30th. But also statutorily, we may revise our budget by January 31st of 2026. And that's the acknowledgement that none of these timelines line up ideally. And so we're going to do the best we can, certainly in the next month and a half, to have something as best as we know in front of you through discussions, through our budget design, budget advisory, those things. But knowing that we can continue to monitor and adjust is helpful.
One other
I think-
quick thought on that, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to add one more thing, Kevin, and that is that the legislative session has to end by May 7th, unless they go ahead and, propose something longer. But so we should have final numbers, and I don't think there's any indication from anyone that this is going to go in excess of that. They can call, to call a special session. So we should have actual numbers from the state by May 7th, which will help with all of this too. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, that's absolutely, and we probably will get those numbers a little before that. It's really when the School Finance Act is done.
And I just ask at the next meeting, you all bring your collective finance team crystal balls, please. And the reason I just want to put this in the room is that I'm thinking about the community engagement sessions that we've had. I'm thinking about eliciting feedback from our community as we're now interpreting and wrestling with the ballot language of 4A and what it now is going to mean, and make sure that we can deliver on some of the promises that we all made. I want to be mindful of that, and also give space so that we can get the feedback and get the iterative feedback loops that we need from our community, from constituents, from negotiations and all that. I think as I'm framing some of the challenges that we're going to be grappling with as a board and as a governance team is, and I'll say this as delicately and indelicately as I can, but I think that from some of the conversations we had at our last engagement session that really stuck out with me is I'm now framing this conversation around small schools as we're looking at the future, looking at our budget, what is the cost of closing a school in 3 to 5 years if trends dip and we can't rebound as I think that we still probably can with a lot of hard work. What's the cost of closing a school versus what's the cost of keeping it open? And diving deeper into that, what is the cost of expanding that definition of a small neighborhood school too wide? Because $4 million may seem like a drop in our overall budget, but that those expenditures to local schools, and this goes back to the conversation we had about how schools set their budgets. I think that's an important discussion. I think we heard some of that tonight, and this is anecdotal, but I think we need to dive deeply into what that will mean and what those definitional criteria are going to be for small schools. Because I think that will also, the impact of those decisions that we make are going to echo in the years to come as we're grappling with declining enrollment and some of our population trends. So I just want to put that out there, and that's how I'm framing some of the thinking now.
And so I know there was some conversation at the dinner session around what's a small school and what isn't. And so I'm sorry I was late and so I didn't get to hear your answers. But I do think it's important to talk about this out here in public so people are here and people are listening can hear how we defined a small school. And then I did have a constituent ask me like how a choice school, you know, that's all choice, doesn't have a boundary, could be a small neighborhood school. And so I think that we need to kind of be talking out loud about what the answers are to that. You know, how did we define a small school, and how did we decide where the money would go? Like, how did we decide that 1 million would be spent on, you know, AP support? Or so I guess how was that decided? How is a non-boundary school considered a neighborhood school? And I can't remember what the other thing was that I asked, but you know, I guess I just want people to see how we did it.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So we did talk a little in dinner session, and so just to start with what defined a small school, okay? And so the committee decided to adopt the same criteria that the steering committee was using in the spring, which is a 400 and 700 threshold of what was a small school. And so started to look at that.
Just, could I get you to
Sure.
clarify 400 grade school, 700
Yes.
for a middle school,
Yes,
right?
so
for people who were
400,
listening.
yeah, 400 students in an elementary school, so anything below 400, and then anything below 700 at a middle school. And so that was the first type of criteria that we used. And so then in the group that was studying and looking at, like, what would we do if for a pass, we started by looking at what were the current state and what was not available in terms of programming and services at those schools, and what is needed to fill the gap. And so that group of principals, you know, identified here's the areas where we are experiencing a loss of programming or loss of services. And so using that sort of needs-based approach is how we identified then the modeling that we went through. And so we went through various different stages of modeling of like, what if we, you know, applied this much to this group, et cetera. And so how that then aligned with what they identified were the needs. And so then that led the group to identify those 3 levels of programming based on what had been the gap in needs that they were currently experiencing. And so the team also talked about that neighborhood component and really have gotten good, fair feedback about, you know, is it small and neighborhood? Is it small neighborhood? Like, what are we using for that ballot language? And the group did align around that. The small school criteria of 400 and 700 was the priority to the group, and not as much like, are you a choice school, are you a neighborhood school? Okay? And so that was a conversation that the group did have, and ultimately decided that, you know what, everybody who has a gap in what their programming is feeling like it needs to be optimal and what we would consider a PSD promise, that's the group that we should try and serve. And I think it was a very conscious approach to making that consideration. Not to say that that can't be amended, you know, based on wanting to have integrity, but the group really did look at that and wanted to have integrity toward that ballot language. And so determined then that 3-tiered approach that we talked about. And at the time when we were talking about it, it was hypothetical. Like, we think approximately $1 million will need to go into this tier. We think approximately $2 million will need to go into this tier. And we think approximately $1 million will need to go into this tier. And then just in the last week or so, we were able to define, like, where did those actually land in terms of dollar amounts? And so it wasn't quite in those hypothetical buckets. And so I think, through conversations and feedback, we're like, okay, now that we see the actual numbers, what might we need to adjust and do differently? The next level of work that the committee identified that needed to be done was in the size factor adjustment, which is what I would consider the fourth bucket that has been applied to schools for several years now, that there's been a size factor adjustment. The committee identified that that needs to be looked at again and needs to be updated to reflect the current state. So that was another factor in consideration. The other piece that was in consideration is whatever we do within these three tiered buckets, we need to look out 5 years into the future, and where will the $4 million take us? Will it last 5 years? And so that was another piece in the consideration. So that group then made a recommendation to apply that three-tiered approach to this year's budget cycle for schools to receive that benefit in their school-based budget.
Okay, so if we were like saying, we were looking at the 400 for an elementary school, but the elementary school could only hold 400 kids, it would still be 100% enrolled. So did you look at percentage of enrollment in the schools? Like I wonder about some of these schools. I look in here and I see that they are really small buildings. And so I'm wondering, what is the percent of enrollment? I've got the hard numbers up for enrollment, but I don't know what percentage enrollment they have. Did you look at that, at the percent enrollment? So if a school is 80% enrolled, would we still be giving it help even if it came in under the 400?
Yes. Yeah, so that size factor, the size factor that has been in place for many years has been applied universally to, on a sliding scale, just about enrollment. It has nothing to do with utilization and capacity. And so that same approach was not applied in terms of utilization when we looked at those three tiers.
And one of the reasons by that is that the majority of these budgets go to staff. So when you think about what resources are needed, it's really what number of staff are needed with the number of kids. And yes, the capacity does come into play a little bit, but I think it's more driven by how many teachers and paras do we need to serve this number of kids?
Go ahead, Kevin.
Sorry, I have another one. And again, I think I'm going to echo this one more time, that I think we need to potentially reevaluate our definitional criteria, because I'm with you, Caroline. It doesn't sit well with me, because again, when I'm knocking on doors and I was going to engagement sessions to pass 4A, I know what I had in my head as far as what a small neighborhood school meant. And for a lot of the community, I believe, so there's two charges here. There's that, is I think we need to be more intentional with how we're defining a small neighborhood school. I don't want to speak into the room utilization rates again, but I think that's where we're edging towards, is a capacity ratio. So a school that may be teetering on a 400 but has 398 kids is still receiving that factor size adjustment, which I'm kind of, I don't know if the wisdom is still there, especially as 4A gets stretched out. It's only going to do so much for a 5-year forecast, et cetera. So shrinking that pot to who's available to receive it is going to do more good for the schools likely that need it more right now. The second charge is not for just us in this room, but I think I want to dispel the notion. I've said this in a lot of our engagement sessions. This is how I'm thinking about it, is that this $4 million small school Band-Aid is not the end-all be-all. I think we're seeing that in our numbers now. I think we're doing a nice job forecasting kind of where we're going to be. So I don't want our community to fall asleep at the wheel, so to speak. I think that it's not, as far as what's in our locus of control, I'm very interested in looking at population trends in certain sectors, especially in District B, because that's where I'm from, in the southwest part of town. Why are enrollment trends going that way, and what can we do about it? And I think there has to be a reimagining of how we're branding our schools. I'm looking at John Cope behind us, is doing an excellent job with Choose PSD. And I think that what we discussed, I got some really good insights from our board engagement session on last Thursday about how different schools, the thought being there was a more competitive market 20 years ago, as far as each school had to have a brand. Each school had to have an identifiable program that separates it, distinguishes itself from another school in close geographic proximity. I don't think that's the wisest thing to do. And I think last year's exercise exacerbated that, and that it became a system of fiefdoms that was saying we're better than everyone else, come choose us. So I do want to challenge some of the notions of having too much choice in our programming. And again, this isn't my jurisdiction to say that, but I think we need to start thinking more boldly in some of our schools and what we're choosing to do. And having programs that don't correlate to a high school feeder in any discernible way that I can find, I think is just another way of paralyzing parents who are looking at the system saying, where do we go? I think the neighborhoods, if I were king, neighborhood schools, it wouldn't matter what the program offered. There is choice still in that program, so if I want to avail myself of that and go elsewhere because I know my kid better, there's that option. But your neighborhood school is going to hit all the bells and whistles, and you're not forcing principals to make a program choice between, can I afford another special, or do I really need to buttress my specials or special ed teachers or things like that? So that's not a conversation we can handle tonight, but I think it's an important one for our community to start grappling with and to not be asleep at the wheel. And I've heard the word urgency a lot tonight. This is another urgent request, I think. We need to start being bold about how we're thinking about our neighborhood schools and what we're going to offer and how we're going to start rolling up our sleeves to address some of the enrollment trends, because it can't just be central office, it can't just be our district or a marketing campaign that's going to solve all of the ills. So I don't have the answer, but I think that's an important part of the conversation.
I think one of the things I want to point out, yes, what this is showing, you are correct, is that as every school gets smaller, the funds can do less and less because we need more and more of them, and we are stuck at the 4 million mark. What I will counter-argue is, first of all, if you look at the ballot language, which the 7 of us went through, we tested it, we marketed it, we made revisions, and then we approved it, has a comma in it. It says small, comma, neighborhood schools. The comma makes a difference. Let's eat grandma is different than let's eat grandma. So we need to be aware that that makes a vast difference, okay? So, sorry, it's the librarian in me. But it makes a big difference. And we need to be aware of that. And we also need to be aware that when we were knocking doors last year, we were talking about a PCA. We talked about them a lot. And if we're going to remove them from a small school, I think we're going to have people knocking on our doors again. So just to be aware that as we, it's unfortunately what I feel like this is doing is bringing back that fighting against each other. And I want us to be very aware of that we don't, as a board especially, bring back that thought process of we lose if they win and they win if we lose. So we all have to be doing this together. We all have to be figuring out how can we make the most of this for all of our kids. And I think there are definitely discussions that need to be had, and I just want people to be very thoughtful about that when we are talking, because when we start talking about winners and losers, that can be very detrimental to all of our kids. So just being aware of that. Anything else before we go ahead?
I would just say, I agree with you, Kristen. We don't want to have winners or losers, but we also want to be sure to have thoughtful and constructive conversations in public so that everybody knows what the board is thinking, knows what the board is up against, knows that the board is taking community feedback seriously. So when you write to us or you call us and you ask us questions, we are having a lot of conversations around that. And I think it's really important to have this conversation in public.
Agreed. Go ahead, Jess.
It pains me a little bit to say it, but I also think there's a difference between a comma, between a verb and a noun, and 2 adjectives. But I'm just going to throw that out there. That's not really my question, but I couldn't help it because you are the librarian and I am the mathematician, and that seems, I had to poke. Anyway, my real question is, can you explain how the size factor came to be? How it's like, I just need I need to wrap my head around what that actually means, and how we calculate it, because it's applied to pretty much every school. I mean, the vast majority of our schools.
All but the high school.
Yeah, so I just want to understand, because in my mind, size factor feels like it shouldn't be all schools, so I just want to understand, where that came from.
Sure. I get the job of being the historian often, so let's go through it. When we first moved to student-based budgeting almost 19 years ago, we moved off of an FTE model into a weighted formula model. And when we did that, we identified a number of factors that we were considering, like at-risk, and at that time we were thinking of free lunch. We also looked at language proficiency, that was another one. GT was another piece. And so that's where we started moving in that direction. But what we did at that time, and this was again 19 years ago when we were doing this, is we were running models to say, okay, this is where you are and this is where you're going to be. And what we realized the first year is that there was a big missing piece because of size. And so what we did at that time is we hired a firm, they're called Augenblick, Palick and Associates. They do a lot of adequacy work at the state level. They came in and helped us look at size. And there's actually, I could probably find the size study or the report that we did from back then. And what we did is they led us through an exercise where we built prototypical models. And what that meant is we started at a school of like 600, and we said staff that. And so we had principals, I can't remember all the people that were in there like 19 years ago, but we had good representation across the district, and we talked about what are the needs at those different levels. And so you define a staffing model for the larger school, and then the way the approach was is you start ratcheting it down. So you say, okay, if there's 100 fewer kids in that school, what does that look like? What does that staffing model look like? And what we found is that there was high variability based on teachers and paras. So as schools, like that was very variable. Where it really got sticky is, and then this is why we're talking about it again, is when schools get smaller, the specials and the other pieces that are not necessarily driven by like a student count purely start getting sticky. And the best example, and I know it's not the greatest example because we really want to focus on instruction, but think of an office manager. The wisdom at that time with that small school study was we have to have somebody monitoring people coming in and out of the door regardless how big we are. We can't have a half-time person there. They need to be there full time. So what that does is it creates a fixed cost in something that we're trying to apply a variable formula to. The way we compensated for that is we created a size adjustment. And the size adjustment was trying to compensate for things like being able to continue to have a full-time office manager or somebody at the door to monitor people coming in and out. It also started coming into specials as well. So that's 19 years ago, that's where it started. We really didn't change student-based budgeting a lot. There were a couple of modifications around English language and stuff like that where we pulled some out and didn't do that. But it wasn't until it was actually COVID, the first year of COVID, that there was a desire at that time to relook at the entire formula. And so we convened a committee again. I did not hire Augenblick, Palick and Associates again because I saw what they did last time and it wasn't that hard. And so we did it again. And we had a room full of principals. There was some teachers in that group as well. And I kind of facilitated, but they led me through building prototypical models again. And so we started at 500 and then we started moving down and we started looking at what are those costs that are fixed in nature that we need to adjust for size, and then what are those that are purely variable. And what we did is we just built staffing plans for all these prototypical models, and then we can cost those out. We can come up with a dollar amount. And what you find in that analysis is those fixed costs are what generate the need for a size. So we did revisit that. I can't remember exactly when was COVID, 2020. That was that year that we actually started doing that work. It was 20 through 20. It was the fiscal year 21 when we did it. And we did make some changes to the size adjustment. We also made some other fairly large changes to student-based budgeting at that time. Prior to that, we used to have one base unit for elementary, middle school, and high school. Based on the work and the prototypical models and the way we approached it, we realized that we don't need as much of that. And so that was another piece. The prototypical models just yielded that. So it was an interesting journey on this. I think again, as Dr. Guile had mentioned, as we were going through the small school discussion, it came up again to say, should we be looking at the size factor? That's where it came from, and that's what it's trying to do. And it really comes back again to trying to compensate for those costs that are more fixed and not variable.
Okay, then I guess I'm still confused, because that would imply to me that if a school, like if an elementary school was above the 400, that they wouldn't need that, or they wouldn't get that. So I'm confused why, like, our elementary schools that are above 400 or middle schools that are above 700, wouldn't they be fully funded?
So we built the elementary prototypical model. We started at the high end at a 4-round school. And then what we were doing is dropping the enrollments and building staffing plans against that. So even at the higher level, as you decline, your funding is declined by that same amount. So theoretically, your office manager and those specials and everything else is needing to decline as well. And so as you go away from that higher end model down lower, there is like a continuum. So it's like a curve. And as you go down further and closer to getting smaller, the curve starts kicking up exponentially. And that was the challenge that we had, is that we knew that with declining enrollment, that because of the exponential nature of that size curve, that the size adjustment was going to need to keep growing and growing and growing as we got smaller and smaller.
I understand. So another way of saying that too, Dave, correct me if I'm wrong, is that, as I was wrestling with this too, and how I understand it is that that formula is basically set regardless of those thresholds of 400, 700, meaning that if there is a delta one way or another with that school beyond a certain point, it's still going to reconcile or account for that dip based on that formula. And I think I understand some of that too would be that a larger school is then going to start budgeting for more staff, and then all of a sudden have fewer kids, but still have the same fixed cost, more or less, of that staff to adjust for that. So that buffer would then be appropriate in that situation. I think where I'm getting at, and I don't want to speak for you, Jess, but I think the concern there being is that if we're using those 400, 700 thresholds to define what is a small school and therefore apply the Band-Aid there, I think that it seems inappropriate to me to then apply that same, or the different factor to schools that are already exceeding that threshold, almost at the expense of what we could be giving to a smaller school if you were to reappropriate that back into the funding. Does that make sense? Because you lost me along the way.
I think I caught most of that. I think it does make sense. I think the wisdom right now is that we do need to come back and look at the size adjustment again.
And just one thing to add, it's not a consistent size factor from school to school to school to school to school. Every school has a different population. It's a graduated scale. So whether you have 280, 275, that size factor changes. So it's not the same number for each school. It is relative to the enrollment.
And it increases exponentially that's what Brian's talking about, is it starts out small, and then as you get smaller, it starts to come in even heavier.
Go ahead.
Does this include, does the size factor adjust for, like you mentioned, English language learners? I assume, no? That's not?
No, the size factor was really focusing on those costs that are not variable or not purely variable. So again, the office manager is the best example, but you could apply that to specials. You could apply that to counseling. You could apply that. Mental health is different. We require a full-time mental health. But when you're funding based on number of students, as you decline, you're not able to buy 100% of that. And so what happens is, to be able to maintain that, the schools are cutting paras and other things like that to keep those specials and those things full. And the size factor was trying to come in and compensate for that so that we weren't taking away from the teachers and para side to fund fixed costs. And that's why it was generated.
So that would make me expect that a school that has fewer students would have a larger size factor than a school with more students, but that's not what this table tells me.
You don't have the size factor in front of you. You have the change in the size factor. The size factor is much bigger.
I think one more thing, can you, I think there was some misinformation earlier today about the last part of that too, the AP support. And so I don't know if we can just go over what that is.
That was part of my other question. I forgot.
Thank you, yeah.
So The AP support has always been tied to enrollment. So X number of students equals a central allocation of AP support. And so in the process of that committee in determining what were those three tiers, what was a gap that principals have noted was that a large portion of their SPB was going to pay for those other AP costs. So our formula for allocating out APs was typically a partial, like a lot of schools were getting a half-time allocation. And so then they were backfilling the other half-time of that administrative support from their student-based budget. Therefore, it was not, allowing them to put it toward other resources in the school, like licensed staff and paras. And so the thinking in the committee is if that central allocation were then increased for that particular funding source, it would free up the SBB, so schools then could really and truly apply that to licensed and paraprofessional staff. And so that formula was adjusted to reflect the ability to free up resources within their student-based budget.
So all the schools have an AP, either part-time or full-time, right? I mean, all of them, right? That's
Nearly.
That's not a site decision,
That's
just-
correct. Nearly all of them do have that, with the exception of the mountain schools.
Okay. Other questions? Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
I appreciate this conversation. I think it is really important, as Carolyn was saying, to have this in public. I think we all learned our lesson last year and how engaged our community is. I am always amazed when we get emails, how well thought out and how much time people spend writing these emails to us. So I think we owe it to them to spend the same amount of time talking about it in public and behind the scenes to really get to the right answer. So I appreciate all this. I appreciate the work that's been done on the budget. I know from my own personal experience, after putting a ton of work into it, to then say, hey, go back to the drawing board is one of the most frustrating things ever. We're not necessarily saying completely go back to the drawing board, but I think we have legitimate questions to be answered and addressed. So I want to encourage you guys that we're not pulling the rug out from under you, but we are just asking the questions that the community is asking. On a totally separate subject, for Brian, whose legs are really tired right now.
Pretty much.
On the Ascent, the $700,000 reduction, what % reduction is that compared to what we've done in the past?
It looks like what was proposed in one of those amendments, I haven't done the exact math on it, about 30%
Okay.
of a reduction in that per pupil rate.
And we were hearing during earlier in the legislative session that Ascent might go away completely. So we kind of thought that was a good place to land.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think I want to make sure the community knows that our elected officials heard you, because I've heard that, that there was a big pushback on that because a lot of people plan for a couple of years to be a part of Ascent. I think it will be important for us to get communication out as quickly as possible about that for this year and what the implications are for next year, because I've heard that it might be gone completely next year, so, which would just be a travesty. But anyhow, hard decisions have to be made, so I appreciate that information. Thank you.
Can I make one final comment?
Yeah, absolutely.
Kind of on that note too, there's a sense of uncertainty and people are very nervous about everything. Depending on how you're going to be affected by some of the national trends, from the state trends, at least from my vantage, I'm looking at the professionals across this table and behind me and in this room, and I feel a level of calm and comfort that we have analyzed, scrutinized. We don't have all the answers. We can't project certainty as much as it would mollify some of the concerns of our community, but I feel very good about where we are, the experts in the room having been through this and the historical piece that you add to this. And so I just want to project my own calm to our community that we've got some really dedicated, incredibly talented, smart people that are looking at this. Yes, we're going to have hard conversations. No, it's not going to be perfect. And yes, there are going to be some unhappy people at the end of any budgetary cycle. And I don't want to minimize the importance of those concerns, but I feel very confident going into the next couple of months that we've got our arms around the problems that we can identify, that we can control, and we'll make some tough decisions together. So I want to thank you again for all the work and making me feel calm. This process is not opaque, or as less opaque as it can be, and that we're armed with information. That's all we can ask.
Yeah, go ahead. I just want to echo what you said, Kevin. I think it is a level of transparency and calm and knowing what we are looking at here, and being able to have those discussions, I think is huge. And so I just want to say thank you for that. And I think one of the best things about this group here is that we can agree to disagree sometimes, right? So I think that's one of our strong suits. But the fact that we can have those tough discussions and we can go ahead and be confident in the information, I think is huge. So I just want to again echo that. Thank you.
I'm gonna jump on this train because I was thinking earlier, in my 3 years, we've had really hard conversations about budgets between COVID, consolidation, and all the things happening this year. Like, it hasn't been an easy cycle yet, and I know you've been doing this a long time. And while we've had hard conversations, we've had frustration, I also have never had to lose sleep wondering if we're doing the best we possibly can for our students and our district and our community. So I just want to throw out the thank you of, as far as we're going to continue to have hard conversations and hard questions and push back, as we should, like that's our job. But also, I just want you and your team to know how much, if I didn't trust you, I wouldn't feel comfortable pushing back, right? It would be different. So the fact that we can push back and we can have the hard conversation publicly and still know that we're going to come out on a good place when we're done, I really appreciate the comfort that I feel, and I think the community feels with that.
I feel like that's how we come to better solutions in the end, is when we are challenged and we have that dialogue back and forth. I really want to thank you for that. I know that pretty much 2/3 of my team is hearing that directly right now, of the leadership team, and so I do really appreciate that a lot.
All right, thank you. Thanks for the conversation and questions. All right.
Jim, did you have something? You had your hand up a minute.
I guess I would say ditto. No, of the three comments here, a huge level of trust. Thank you for everything.
I just want to add, pretty soon 3 of us won't be here, come November. And it's nice to know that when you step away, that there's still going to be really great staff here to support the next board of directors. That's such a comfort, I think, for every board of director who's left the board, that, it's being left in really good hands, and that the staff has always been great about supporting me for 11 years. And I've had some great relationships with the staff here, and I just appreciate all of you. I know, I'm getting ready to cry.
I know. All right. Well, once again, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.